I'm Gerard O'Brien. I've been working on this Glen project, a historical project, for about 2 years, but it's been something in the back of my mind for practically most of my life because I actually grew up in the centre of the Glen. I am I'm a literary person by trade. I lecture in Anglo-Irish literature in Galway, uh, and um, and I'm also a writer, a novelist. But but history and actually a lot of my novels come out of I'll get stuck in a local history project and get deeply involved in that, and then a novel might come out of that of the background that I've built up. So that's often the way I work. But the Glen project, historical project, was something that I suppose was something that I always wanted to do because when I grew up in the middle of, um, like our house had this extensive ruins of a mill are all around it. And there were bits, there was like one of the old millstones was just there peeking out of the ground. And, you could trace the waterways, and I was always curious about it. Back it's amazing, I suppose. It's wonderful how research has improved, because there wasn't an awful lot of information you could find in those days. There weren't a lot of places you could go to look for things, but I was always very curious about what these places were. When it started, when was the first mill? Was it 15th century? Was it 18th century? Was it 19th century? And So I always had these questions, and I thought, before getting on, so I thought I'd better get the bloody thing down on paper before it's lost forever. Because now, the other motivation was that all the houses, all the buildings that I knew, and the ruins of former buildings, they're all gone now, and nobody would even imagine that there were such places there. A photograph taken in 1954, which is very interesting, revealing kind of photograph. It's taken as you come in from Blackpool, with Goulding's factory in the foreground and the Glen up behind it. And what is extraordinary about it is this is 1954. You're in the middle of the countryside. To the left and the right of Goulding's factory are just expanses of fields. And if you look deep into that photograph, it's a very good photograph with sort of fairly good detail in it, right up to and Cahergal on the other side, up towards St. Joseph's Church, up towards Mayfield. Hardly a house. There are the odd houses dotted around, but hardly a house. All of that development took place from the early 60s onwards. The first real housing boom, the first Celtic Tiger, I suppose you might say. You saw all of these houses being built, and then when the Glen estate then was built in 1967, of course that then changed. It had all sorts of repercussions for the Glen, what is now the River Park for Goulding's Glen, because one of the things that had to be done to cater for the sewage from these two new huge housing estates in Mayfield and the area is actually called Rathmore, but it's rather confusing to talk about the Glen. It's actually Rathmore is the townland there. But to cater for these two housing estates, they had to put in massive sewage drainage scheme, which ran right down through the Glen, and that was really the first of the destruction of all the old world, because this huge drainage scheme, like the trench, I remember, was. The trench was 7 or 8 feet across. It was fairly wide, and the pipes, massive sewer pipes, went into it. So to do that, of course, they bulldozed everything. So all the traces of the old industrial buildings, the old mills, and all that, they were all then wiped out in the course of laying this sewage thing. So that was the beginning, really, of the end of the old Glen. All the waterways were destroyed, all the old buildings were destroyed, and the character of it was fairly radically changed. And I suppose, to an extent, then it went through a rather unfortunate period of dereliction after it was passed over to the Cork Corporation, before any kind of development could actually, any kind of amenity development could be brought underway. And of course, we have to remember as well, you're talking about 70s into the 80s. Like people talk about the financial crash of 2007. You know, in my recollection, the crash of the 1980s for Cork anyway was way worse. It was absolutely desperate. Nobody had any money. The corporation didn't have any money either. So the Glen was allowed to fall into ruin, rather sadly, you know. And it became a public dump, and it became, you know, kids used to steal cars and, you know, drive them into the Glen and set them on fire. So you had all these skeletons of cars around the place, and it suffered rather badly from that. But a lot of it had to do with the economic situation. The money wasn't there to make something fairly decent quickly. There were plans there. In fact, the curious thing about the Glen and that whole area was that as early as 1947, if you look at the Cork Corporation minutes, you find discussions, and the city engineers commissioned to do a study on the idea of acquiring the Glen as an amenity, and of controlling the building on the Glen Rim, what they call the Glen Rim, because you know, to preserve its unique character. So they were actually thinking about it in 1947, but didn't actually get around to doing anything about it for nearly, you know, half a century later. You know, that expression, big bodies move slowly. Well, they certainly move slowly. Yeah, but so I suppose, and then of course the Glen housing estate. The other problem about it was, even though they had their sights on it from 1947, I suppose it was really the baby boom. You know, the kids that were born in the 1950s, like myself, the huge increase in population of young people coming of age by about 1970 put a huge demand on the council to provide houses. And I mean, you know, like the baby boom kind of lasts about 4 or 5 years. So you had this huge bulge in population, you know, from the early 50s coming of age in 1970. So there was this massive demand to provide council houses for the population. And something had to be done really fast, and had to be done cheap. So it was fast and cheap, you know. It wasn't cheap and cheerful, but it was fast. So the method of building the houses, you know, constrained presumably by economics, and also probably by lack of experience, because I think the method of building the houses, the technology that was used, was midway between what we now understand about, you know, things being more ecologically and environmentally and you know, being better insulated, and, you know, sort of in a you know, the standards weren't, the technology wasn't there really to keep up with the ideas. So you had sort of mass concrete gable ends and plywood, you know, plywood structures, you know, they couldn't have been very warm. They mustn't have been very comfortable. And then you had all these young families chucked in there, young mothers and fathers, who in a more normal situation, you know, a generation even before that, would have, first of all, there wouldn't have been so many of them there. And second of all, they would have had extended family support. They're all suddenly dumped into this brand new housing estate, you know, and there were no clubs, no schools, you know, there was nothing there really to sort of give them, or anything really to give them a sense of community. And there was no tradition. Like you have in a traditional housing estate, you'll have people of various age groups in their 40s and 60s, so on, who will create a kind of a tradition. So when a new person comes in, they kind of know, you got to toe the line this way, you got to toe the line that way. Well, I suppose in terms of growing up there, I mean, it was, you know, living in an isolated house in the middle of the Glen like that. It had, in some ways, it was wonderful. You know, it was a place that it was a magical place. You know, you had an enormous amount of freedom. Um, the downside of it was that it could be very lonely. You know, I mean, when I was very young and at school, you know, I'd make friends at school, and I'd say, you know, come down to my place and we'd play. You know, the mothers wouldn't let them. You know, you can't go down the Glen. They wouldn't allow them down the Glen. You know, so, but the one of the things that not just me, but I think any kids that did grow up in the Glen, because it was a wild place. You know, was you learned an awful lot of cop on. You know, you learned how to look after yourself, and I think that that was a thing that the kids growing up in the Glen did learn. And you know, but for me personally, living in the Glen, it was wonderful. It was. We used to have the waterways used to flow through the garden. There was it was a 10-foot waterfall. You know, so you had all the time the sound of this of the water rumbling away. You know, sort of and it was very peaceful and very pleasant, and an ideal childhood in many ways, you know, sort of a kind of a Garden of Eden. But there were a few serpents around on the outside, I have to say. It wasn't all plain sailing, but on the whole, I wouldn't exchange my childhood there for anything.